Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good evening to everyone out there listening to WCATradio.com. My name is Robert Madrigal, the host of this show, Know Your Faith, a forum for those who know the faith, a source for those who would like to get to know the faith, aka Unapologetically Apologetics. On this show, we talk about Catholic apologetics, and we are unapologetic about our love for Christ, our love for the Catholic Church. Now, last week we spoke about misinformation and the play on words that society, especially the media, uses to make a point. Now, when talking strictly about the media, this essentially amounts to propaganda. This week I'd like to carry on with the second of my three-part series on propaganda, and I will continue my presentation, which I originally wrote for a PowerPoint that I started last week, which I aptly named Misinformation, Myths, Lies, and Videotape. Well, before we get into tonight's topics, I would like to start the show off right with a prayer. So we begin our prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we come to you in great thanksgiving this evening for this opportunity to come together as brothers and sisters in Christ, so that we may learn more about our faith for the sake of defending the faith. We ask that you will grant us the strength to explain and defend our faith with patience and charity, and to see challenges to our faith as a chance to evangelize and to spread the love and peace of Christ to all whom we meet. And we ask that we are given the strength to do this through the example of self-sacrifice that Christ provides for us through his death on the cross. We ask this through the glorious name of Christ our Lord. Amen. And we'll end our prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Okay, so last week we ended our show with a discussion on how information is manipulated and controlled. The manipulation of information, if you will. The control of information, and even when information is withheld for the purposes of propaganda. Last week we ended our discussion with some facts about the French Revolution that our high school history class usually leaves out, and when this is done, it usually leaves students here in the U.S. misinformed about history. So tonight we're going to look at some of the information that is being withheld. And with that, I must warn everybody that this show will contain information that might be very upsetting to our listeners, so please get yourself ready for that. So last week I was just touching on the Catholic martyrs that were given to us by the violent rulers of France, who at the time of the French Revolution called for an end of both the monarchy and the Catholic Church in France. We talked about the roles that Maximilien Robespierre, Napoleon Bonaparte, and groups like the Jacobins played in the attempted destruction of our beloved church in France. And we closed up the discussion with a count of the cost in human lives that France had to pay for the so-called social justice that the revolutionaries called for at the time. So what was the cost in human lives for the social justice fought so hard for during the revolution in France? The so-called justice of taking down the monarchy and the Catholic Church and replacing them with a committee of public safety and a state-run church. Well, the initial revolution cost France 40,000 lives, 290,000 in the genocide in the Vendée, and roughly 50,000 in executions. Some estimates are actually as high as 400,000 to 500,000 for the revolution itself. But then we have the French Revolutionary Wars, fought against just about every other European country at the time. And the war started by Napoleon, known of course as the Napoleonic Wars. All in all, there was an estimated 3 million Frenchmen who laid down their lives for the revolution and for Napoleon. And that's not counting the soldiers of other countries who were killed trying to stop the revolutionaries and their reign of terror by defending themselves against the French. Now, does that sound like social justice to you? That's what the revolutionaries said they were fighting for, social justice, but it doesn't really sound like that was achieved, does it? That is probably the worst bloodletting in France by the French or anyone else in French history. 3 million deaths in France alone. But the saddest part of it all was that all of this happened for no reason at all, because afterwards, after the French Revolution was over and Napoleon took over and did what he did, the two institutions that the revolutionaries fought so hard to get rid of were restored. And those two institutions are the monarchy and the Catholic Church. Yet, the thing about that is that it was the same monarchy that was restored, the same bloodline of French kings. It was Louis XVI's brother, King Louis XVIII, was placed on the throne of France when they restored the monarchy. Louis XVIII actually took the name 18th in order to pay homage to his very own nephew, Louis XVII, the son of Louis XVI. I hope that's not too confusing. Well, Louis XVII never got a chance to rule, as he died as a child in the care, or actually the better word for it is imprisonment, of the revolutionaries under the guidance of the Committee of Public Safety. And he was only 10 years old at the time. Now, if you have never heard of this information before, doesn't it sound a lot like information that's being withheld? But that's just the beginning. And we are just skimming the surface of information that is withheld about history. What do we know about World War II? If I ask that question, what would be the first thing that would come to your mind about World War II? Now, usually the answer to that is 6 million Jews who were systematically exterminated. Now, this is very tragic, of course, but aside from war casualties, has anyone ever heard of the non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust at the hands of not only the Nazis, but also the communists? History usually leaves out the non-Jewish genocide in Poland at the hands of the Nazis. The 3 million people, mostly Catholics, who were killed in Poland. Now, has anyone out there listening ever heard of the Dachau concentration camp? Now, the Dachau concentration camp was one of the first concentration camps set up by the Nazis. And this was a camp inside of Germany. Tens of thousands of non-Jewish German prisoners, and these were mostly Christian, both Catholic and Lutheran. And this includes priests, deacons, bishops, and lay people who spoke out against the regime. We're talking about 32,000 documented deaths and thousands more that went undocumented. Also, the Christian persecutions in Poland included priests, deacons, bishops, and lay people, who were Catholic and were taken prisoner and thrown into concentration camps. Saint Maximilian Kolbe was one of them, and he died in Auschwitz. Now that shows that there were non-Jewish victims of the Nazis who were killed in Auschwitz. Of course, he was starved to death. Another component of that is the Nazis supervised the expulsion of millions of Poles from their homes. They just kicked them out of their homes and told them, find someplace else to live because now Germans are going to live here. And during that expulsion, there were many summary executions, and the great majority of them were being Catholic Christians. Now moving on, and next on my list are the 11 million Russian Orthodox Christians who were starved to death during the Russian forced famine. So what was the Russian forced famine? That was when the communist government in Russia needed food to feed their army for the collectivization process. So they took it from the civilian population, causing a famine. And the saddest part of all that was that the Russian Revolution called for the need for social justice, just like they did in France during the French Revolution. And what they were the way they sold their revolution was they were leveling the playing field, so to speak, between the rich and the poor. Not unlike the so-called revolution in France. However, the 11 million people who starved to death were mostly Orthodox Christians, and they were so-called peasants, otherwise known as the poor. They weren't rich people who they were taking down a notch or two off of their pedestals. These were poor people who starved to death. Now, going back a little further in history, there's the Cristeros War of Mexico. The Cristeros War was a popular uprising in Mexico where tens of thousands of Mexican citizens came together, formed an army, and went to war against their government and in defense of our beloved Catholic Church. Now, they went to war in response to persecutions brought on by the very stringent anti-clerical laws passed by the Mexican Congress, which were meant to permanently rid Mexico of the Catholic Church. Now, this was a time of barbaric violence against priests, deacons, bishops, and lay people of the Catholic Church. Now, at this time in history, during the 1920s, the Knights of Columbus were especially singled out because of their devotion and fervor towards Orthodox Catholic teaching. Now, in order to better understand why regular, peace-loving, everyday Catholics would take up arms and march off to war, we could start by looking at the actions of a man known in history as Plutarco Elias Calles. Calles was elected president of Mexico in 1924. When he started to enforce the very strict anti-Catholic laws that were written right into the 1917 Mexican Constitution. Now, an example of such laws is Article 7 of the Mexican Constitution, and it's still on the books today, which states that the church cannot own any land in Mexico. This essentially turned any land that was owned by the Catholic Church in Mexico at the time into government property overnight. But then Calles took it up a notch or two by introducing new laws into Mexico, which came to be known as the Calles Laws. Now, these laws were written for the sole purpose of taking the Catholic Church apart in Mexico bit by bit. And it's not unlike what happened in France during their revolution. But what led to the Calles presidency and paved the way for these atrocities to occur is a topic that is just as important. And what I'm talking about here is an event known in history as the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution was fought under revolutionaries such as Francisco Villa, or otherwise known as Pancho Villa. The Mexican Revolution was the event that ushered in the atheist government that made it possible for men like Plutarco Calles to carry out the persecution, rape, and murder of an entire country. But because of misinformation, aka propaganda, that is spread about the Mexican Revolution, Pancho Villa is considered a hero by most Mexicans nowadays, and even most Hispanic Americans, even to this day. He was and still is compared to the fictional Robin Hood of England, and even to our very own George Washington. But the truth is that Villa's army carried out just as many atrocities against the Catholic Church as the Mexican government did under Calles. The actions that Villa and his army took against the Catholic Church included the forced expulsion of priests and nuns from their parish residence and convents. Now, I don't even want to mention the actions taken by the individual soldiers of Villa's army against the nuns of Mexico, because that would be far too upsetting. Furthermore, between the expulsions and the dangers posed by Villa and his army to the nuns of Mexico, by the end of the revolution, there were hardly any nuns left in Mexico. A lot of them came here to the United States. Now, as for Calles himself, during his reign, besides the expulsion of foreign-born priests from Mexico, there were the executions of priests throughout the country. Now, two of the most famous that are very well known, and were very well known at the time, were the executions of Padre Francisco Vera and Padre Pro. A lot of people know these names in Mexico if you're Catholic, but not so much here in the United States. Viva Cristo Rey was their last words. That was their battle cry, and that was the battle cry of the Cristeros. Now, there was an event in Mexico, and there was a torture and execution of a young man who was known as Jose Sanchez del Rio. Now he's a saint. He was just given his sainthood not so long ago. I believe it was 2 years ago. Who was only 14 years old when they tortured him. They skinned the bottoms of his feet and marched him around his hometown of Sahuayo in the state of Michoacan. Then they executed him because he refused to renounce Christ. And Viva Cristo Rey was his last words. And Viva Cristo Rey means long live Christ the King. Now there are pictures in existence today of the Mexican catacombs. They've come to be known as the Mexican catacombs. Because that's where Mexican citizens went underground to attend Mass, because it was illegal to attend Mass at the time. Now, the Cristeros, Cristero is a word that means soldiers of Christ. I have a picture myself that I downloaded from the internet where many people were hanged from telegraph poles as a warning from Calles and his government for citizens to stay away from joining the Cristeros. And all this was done in a country which is very well known for being a majority Catholic country. And this has been for the past century or so, maybe longer. Now, I want everybody to brace yourselves, because what I am about to tell you about is very upsetting. Now, when I first looked this up for this particular presentation, I was very upset when I saw what I saw. Of course, you can't see my pictures, but I'll describe them to you. As if what we have already gone over wasn't upsetting enough, there are facts about the Spanish Civil War that most people I meet have no idea about. And the most disturbing thing that I found out about the Spanish Civil War was that the atheist army of the rebel side went around the country of Spain disinterring nuns and putting their decomposed corpses on public display. Now, they weren't ashamed of doing this at all. They weren't trying to hide it. They took a lot of pictures, and that's why they exist today. This is proof of the persecutions in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. There are also very many Spanish martyrs who came out of the Spanish Civil War. Many nuns who were summarily shot in the head for refusing to denounce Christ. And the same was done to priests. Now, I found a picture from the time that I aptly named Taking Aim at Christ, because it is of that's a slip of the tongue there, rebel forces using a statue of Christ for target practice. And like I said, they weren't very ashamed of doing this. They took many pictures of what they did during the Spanish Civil War. Now, doesn't this sound a whole lot like information that is being withheld? Because I know I didn't know about all this until I looked into it for this presentation. And here again, we have this happening in a country, Spain, which is very well known for being a majority Catholic country. So, since that's true and that's a fact, why is it that these facts of history are not very well known? I think that's a very good question, but wait, there is more. If we go back further in history, we could talk about the Irish forced famine under Oliver Cromwell, brought on by England's need to feed their army after and during the English Civil War. So who did they take their food from? The rich, so that they could level the playing field, so to speak? No, they took it from the poor, hungry Irish Catholics. That's who. We also have the thousands of martyrs that King Henry VIII's reign produced, and the thousands more that we got from his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. Now, going back 3 centuries from there, Edward I of England and his wars against Catholic Scotland and Catholic France. Nowadays, Edward IV might be very well known by most people from his portrayal in the movie Braveheart. He was well known as Edward the Longshanks back then. And these are facts of history. A lot of the parts in that movie were factual. So my question is, what would drive a person to organize an army so that they could commit these types of atrocities? Also, how does one go about building an army of soldiers who would take their time and effort to commit such horrific acts against people they don't even know, and the Catholic Church, mostly Catholics? What I call it is passionate hate. One would have to have a real hate-on for the group or groups of people that they are persecuting. In these cases, it's the Catholic Church. But add to the passionate hate feelings of the need for revenge. And what you have are 2 of the most important elements needed to build an army who would run around killing priests and nuns or lay people just for being Catholic, and in other cases, Jewish. So where does this unique combination of feelings come from? I mean, because we all know that people aren't usually born with these feelings. Passionate hate and revenge. The feelings of hate and revenge are usually taught. Now add to that a target of those feelings, and what you have next is persecutions. But where does it all come from? The word that would fit here and explain it all is propaganda. Now, propaganda is a science that goes way back to antiquity, and it's used to build up support either for or against many ideals and institutions. But in modern times, it's been perfected. Propaganda is used to start wars, along with a host of other evil things. It's used to spread rumor and to build up support for or against movements that can become hate and even persecutions. But to illustrate my point, we're going to have to start off really slow and examine some of the very basics of what propaganda aims to do when the people who produce it try to get inside our minds and our hearts. Now the following presentation will be an examination of the idea behind propaganda. And starting off slow, we could take a look at the very basics and then move into how propaganda works. Now, both Jesus Christ and the prophets of the Old Testament talked about the coming and ongoing persecutions of God's people. But the Bible verse that I want to focus in on for now is Isaiah 5:20. And of course, that's from the Old Testament. One more time, it's Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20, as we read, "Woe to those who call good evil and evil good, who change darkness into light and light into darkness, who change bitter into sweet and sweet into bitter." End quote. Now, I always use the following example of this reading, and you'll see why after I'm done with this explanation. But I use an example in the phrase, a love triangle. Now, bear with me here. It sounds weird for now, but let me explain. I'm sure everyone here knows what a love triangle is. It's three people involved in one love affair. And sometimes it could feel like the answer to someone's dreams. However, this is a perfect example of calling the evil good and the good evil, because the word love has nothing to do with the love triangle, and it has nothing to do with the affair that goes along with it. The problem is that even though a marriage is a good thing that is anointed by God, usually two of the three in a love triangle are a married couple, or two people who are involved in a romantic love affair and a possible marriage. And the third is an intruder. In other words, what we're talking about here is an extramarital affair, or otherwise known as cheating on your spouse. Now, usually this causes a whole lot of trouble and a considerable amount of heartache. Love triangles can oftentimes end up in the news when a jealous spouse means to hurt or even kill the intruding lover, so-called lover, in the triangle. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that, I believe that this is Satan's way of mixing the word love, which is a good thing, and triangle, to make this situation easier for us humans to swallow. And it usually always ends up, causing nothing but trouble, as sometimes, we could see in the news, a lot of times it ends up as a murder-suicide. I've seen it in the news many times. Now, not only that, but the same idea of a love triangle is sometimes used to demonize the idea of marriage. And this is the second part of the verse where it's calling good evil. People often say it was the commitment to just one person that was to blame. If people would be more accepting of open marriages, this type of stuff wouldn't happen. And that type of thought is what's pushed here. That's why I always use the phrase love triangle as an example of calling the evil good and the good evil. But another good example comes from the saying, sex sells. Because propagandists mix the Bible verse, Isaiah 5:20, with that saying, because sex is used to present the good as evil and the evil as good. Bear with me here. Let me explain. My example that I'm going to use comes from Halloween costumes, and this comes from propagandists. And we'll start with the Halloween costume of a sexy angel costume. Now, while I was doing my research for the PowerPoint of this presentation, I found some very skimpy costumes that were representations of angels of God. Now, the most modest image that I could find was I was barely able to use it on my PowerPoint presentation, or the PowerPoint version of this presentation. Yet the rest of the images out there are very inappropriate for this style of presentation, especially put on by a seminarian, which what I was when I put this together. I can even download them onto my computer, much less use them for the presentation. It was very hard to find an image of this type of costume that I could use for the PowerPoint of this presentation and that I would include in the presentation. Now, I hope everyone out there can see the biggest problem with what I'm talking about, the image of a sexy angel. Angels of the Lord are not supposed to be thought of as sexy, much less scantily clad. Excuse me. And it's definitely presenting the good as evil. And I say that because I believe this is Satan's way of adding lust to our belief in angels. Now, this next example of calling the evil good is a perfect example because it is a costume of a sexy devil. Can you see the contrast there? I think this is the way of that Satan promotes. I think this is a way of promoting Satan as a bit more acceptable by propagandists. Now, the idea of Satan being a sexy female is a way of having more men, or having men more readily accepting the image of Satan. Now, that sounds a bit crazy, or maybe I might even sound like a conspiracy theorist, but let's see if we can make sense out of this insane idea. Society in general, the people, the minds of the individuals are like open doors to ideals. Politicians will tell you that this is true because they push their ideals on society in general. And that's how ideals like the Nazis, the KKK, and communism are spread so easily, because the minds of individuals are open to these ideals. And that's because people in general are looking for something to believe in. And God is what we look for, really. But Satan has a way of offering an alternative so that we can turn away from God. Now, what if Satan presented himself to the world as he really is? As a soul stealer and in all his evil magnificence. Or better yet, maleficence. The world would outright reject him, wouldn't we? Even the most devout Satanist would see him for what he really is, and they would turn and run from him if he presented himself as he really is. Now, when I say that, I mean his minions, and his minions work as propagandists. So Satan has to disguise himself as something sexy, something a lot more acceptable. Now, have you ever heard of someone use the phrase, handsome devil? As someone who is handsome, Satan becomes a bit easier to accept, wouldn't he? Now, these are ways ideals are spread through words and through pictures, through movies, and even actions of others. What we hear and what we see, what we hear and what we see in movies and in the media and in everyday life. Now, I see people imitating and repeating the stuff that they hear and see in movies all the time. I used to do it when I was a kid. I got a lot of ideas from movies when I was a kid. And I think it's something that's not very hard to fall into. However, the saddest part about all this is that the ideals are very cleverly hidden and reveal themselves in very subtle hints. Now, I have an example that I could use of the way evil is sold in a nice little package that is very cute and cuddly. I was looking for an image of this sort on the internet, and I found a picture of a teddy bear Satan, complete with a heart on the front of it that says, "I love you." Now, this is an actual teddy bear that parents can buy for their toddlers. And even though this might seem harmless to most people, what we have to keep in mind is that we are talking about little kids and babies who are targeted by teddy bear companies. Now, can you imagine entire generations of infants who have little red teddy bears who resemble images of Satan, complete with horns and a trident, in their cribs with them, that has a heart in front of it that says, "I love you"? Now, my next example is an atheist spin on a popular evangelical Christian saying. And the saying is, "No God, no peace." And this, of course, means that if the world would come to know God, the world would come to know peace, to get rid of war. Now, the anti-religion atheist movement has reversed that, and they've changed it around and now present the saying as, "No God, no peace." Okay, it sounds the same, and you can't really tell the difference on the radio, but to come to know God, K-N-O-W, is the first part of the first saying. The atheist saying is N-O, as in, if there were no God, we would come to know peace. This, of course, means that they want to get rid of God from society by saying we would come to know peace if there were no God. And it is a full-out marketing campaign, complete with coffee cups, T-shirts, and then we have the ever-popular teddy bear and baby bibs. Yes, teddy bears and baby bibs with the saying, "No God, no peace." The atheist part of it, the atheist version of it. All these items are sold with the saying embroidered right on them. Now, I want to kind of switch gears here and start talking about a couple other items that I found on the internet. And there's this saying in the form of music, the same saying, "No God, no peace." A group called Tenacious D, and the D stands for devil. I don't know if everyone out there has ever heard of Jack Black. He's an actor. And he's an actor who once played a superstar wrestling priest who fell in love with a nun in a movie called, excuse me, in a movie called Nacho Libre. Now, they put the song together, he has a friend named Kyle Glass who is also an actor. And these two men, Jack Black and Kyle Glass, formed a group out of the city of Los Angeles. And they put together a song using that saying in the lyrics, "No God, no peace." And they just repeat it over and over in their song. They perform their song on stage with a caricature of Satan. And they have a movie that does the same. I'd like to switch gears again and talk to you about myths. We're going to move away from the propaganda that spreads the idea of showing the good as evil and the evil as good. And I want to move away from that now, and I want to talk about myths. Now, there are many myths out there about the Catholic Church, and there are many Catholics who buy into those myths. Even ardent Catholics fall into the mistaken beliefs that come from many myths that come out of the propaganda about the Catholic Church. Now, what I'm talking about are topics like the Crusades, the Inquisitions, and other things like, was Hitler a Catholic, etc., etc. So what I would like to do is examine the word myths and the myths that surround the Catholic Church in order to see if we can dispel them as myths. First, let's take a look at the word myth. And some synonyms of the word myth are legend, fable, folklore, or fairy tale. Now, the dictionary defines the word myths in two ways. Number one, myth is a set of often idealized or glamorized ideas and stories surrounding a particular phenomenon, concept, or famous person. And number two, the second definition of the word myth is a widely held but mistaken belief. Now, I came up with a demonstration of how myths are started, and this demonstration is a perfect example of how myths are started on the Catholic Church. Now, there is a book out there, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard about it, called Hitler's Pope. And on this, in this book contains many lies about Pope Pius XII, who was Pope at the time that Hitler was in charge of Germany. Now, if you're able to look up a picture of the cover, try to do so. Of course, if you don't have access to the internet right now, or you can't do it while you're listening to the radio, maybe you could just look it up later on. But for now, anyone who doesn't have that picture can use their imaginations, because I just want to point out a few things about the picture that's on the cover of the book, Hitler's Pope. And this image is very misleading. But the picture also sets the stage for the lies to come after one starts reading the book. But before I do that, I'd like to ask everyone out there listening a question. Now, this is a question that I ask anyone who has read the book and believes what they have read. How many lies does someone have to tell you before you think of them as a liar and stop believing what they say? One lie? Two lies? Or would it take more than that? Well, what I'm about to expose are three lies that we could find right on the cover of the book, Hitler's Pope, that should discredit the entire book. Now, the first thing that I could point out about the picture on the cover is that it was tampered with before the book was published. Now, like I said, you have to use your imagination here, but the picture is blurred and hazy. It's a real hazy image, which makes it distorted. Now, when you see the picture, you will notice that this adds a devious facade to it. It looks really devious. So I looked up the picture on Google, and I compared the original picture and the picture on the book side to side. I'll describe it to you. The picture is supposed to be Pope Pius XII coming out of a building with two German soldiers standing guard and a German soldier opening the door for him as he enters his car. And the German soldier is saluting him. Now, when you look at the picture on the book, it gives you a tense, almost angry look to Pope Pius XII. Now, next, it seems like the propagandist who put this book together he's a man named John Cornwell, and sadly, he's Catholic. He depends on assumption because there's a soldier standing guard over the Pope as he exits the building, and a second soldier standing in front of him at attention, giving him a salute. As the title on the book is Hitler's Pope, we assume that everybody in the picture is a Nazi, including the Pope. Now, what I can tell you is that the men in the picture are not Nazis. And I could say this for a few reasons. First, because the soldier standing guard is a German soldier, definitely, but he's not necessarily a Nazi soldier. Germany had an army for centuries before the Nazis came to power. And the only soldiers who were actually Nazis during World War II were the SS. The man in the picture is a regular army soldier. Yes, there were probably instances of German men joining the army because they believed in the Nazi ideals, but the majority of Germany did not. So for the most part, the soldiers of the German army were not Nazis. The Nazis controlled the army, but that's not to say that every soldier of the German army was Nazi. That's the first point I want to make. Most of the German army towards the middle of the war were actually conscripts. Now, second, on the picture on the cover of the book was edited farther, and it's cut short, and the soldier who was saluting Pope Pius XII isn't even a soldier at all, because I took the original picture and I compared it with the picture on the cover of the book, and the man saluting Pope Pius XII isn't even saluting him at all. He's actually a chauffeur. Now, when I compared the two pictures, I saw that the man is actually holding the door of a car, the car door open for the Pope, and he's actually tipping his hat, not saluting. Now, had he been a Nazi saluting the Pope, his arm would be outstretched in front of him with his palm flat. Now, we all know and could recognize the Nazi salute because of war movies from World War II, right? Well, this man is not a Nazi because he's tipping his hat. It looks more like he's saluting him the American salute, putting his hand up to the tip of his hat. That's an American salute as opposed to a Nazi salute where they outstretch their hand in front of them. Now, the third thing that I want to point out about the cover on this book is that the man who we're assuming is Pope Pius XII is not Pope Pius XII. Now, he was the man who was elected Pope and became Pope Pius XII. But his name at the time of the picture, the time that the picture was taken, was Eugenio Pacelli. And he was the cardinal who became Pope Pius XII. But at the time that the picture was taken, he was still cardinal. And I could tell this because when we see the cardinal in the picture, he's wearing black, or it looks like he's wearing black, because the picture is black and white. Now, if he was Pope, he would have been wearing white, and you could see it plain and clear in a black and white picture. But the clothes that the cardinal was wearing appears to be black. He was most likely wearing red, because red would appear to be black in a black and white picture. Now I could tell it's a black and white picture because there's no color in it at all. The cape and the clothes that the man is wearing appear to be black in the picture. So, what I'm talking about here is with the combination of the way the picture is tampered with and the assumptions that could be made because of the title, Hitler's Pope, we can see that 3 lies are contained just in the cover of the book. Now, imagine with 3 lies that you could uncover right on the cover of the book, how frivolous the rest of the book has to be. Now, I would even go so far as to call the book fiction, because there is also a book entitled The Myth of Hitler's Pope, subtitled How Pope Pius XII Rescued Jews from the Nazis. And the funny thing about all this is that the book Hitler's Pope, The Secret History of Pope Pius XII, was put together by a Catholic. The Myth of Hitler's Pope was written by a historian, Jewish man named David G. Dellin, who was a rabbi. Now imagine that. A Catholic writes an assault on a pope, and a Jewish rabbi writes in his defense. Only in America, huh? Now, well, actually, Hitler's Pope came out of England. Now what I want to do is read to you a little something that I found on a website called thewriterstore.com. And I wish I could claim this as my own because it's so very well written. And it's a perfect way to put myth into perspective. And what I'm talking about here is the myth of Hitler's Pope and how myths have been started within this century or the past century. And this puts it into perspective. So here we go. Great myths and legends are not authored by individuals the way stories are written today, but are evolved naturally and instinctively by unconscious processes in oral traditions. Even if they start out as made up or even true stories, revelations or dreams, they still end up for long periods of time in oral traditions, which becomes the principal dynamic behind their creation. Every time a story is told and retold, it changes. This is due to certain natural but curious tendencies of the mind, of the human mind. The tendency, for instance, to remember things that make a strong impression and to forget things that don't impress us very much. There is also a tendency to exaggerate or minimize, to glorify or to ennoble, to idealize or vilify. Beyond that, there's a natural unconscious tendency to analyze things, to take them apart and put them back together in different combinations. Now add to that the natural tendency to simplify and edit. Also, there is a tendency to conserve energy in nature, and it is very strong in everything we do, including how we organize and store our thoughts and memories. Now, these are all things that we do and are very aware of. End quote. And that comes, like I said, that comes from the writerstore.com. Now, there's an old illustration here. If I were to whisper something in the ear of a person sitting at a table, and that person were to whisper it to the person sitting next to them, and it goes all around, completely around the table, by the time it gets back to the first person I whispered the story to, it becomes a totally different story. Now, I have more to this tonight's show and this presentation, but it looks like I'm running out of time right now. So that's all I have time for tonight, and I'd like to say goodbye to everyone out there listening to WCATradio.com. Please join us here again in 2 weeks from now, from today, and we will do a review. We're going to finish up this 3-part series on propaganda. This tonight's show has been number 2, and next week we're going to continue with part 3. Now I'm looking forward to spending this time with everyone out there who are interested in learning and listening to what I have to say, and I would hope to hear from you as well. Please email me at Madrigal, and that's MADRIGAL.Robert, ROBERT, at ymail.com. If you have any questions and more importantly comments, if you would disagree with what I say, maybe you could correct me. And I'd like to say good night to everybody and goodbye. So until then, until 2 weeks from now, may everybody take care and may God be with you in everything you do. Good night.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.